Gordon was resting in the siding. It was a hot day and the express had been heavy. "I get so out of breath," he complained, "but nobody cares. They just say I'll be all right after a rest." "Get the Fat Controller to give you tanks in a bunker," suggested Thomas cheekily. "You feel a new engine. We tank engines never get out of breath, you know." Perhaps it was lucky for Thomas that poor Gordon hadn't the energy to reply. The men worked hard on Gordon, but they couldn't make him better. "You need new tubes, Gordon," they said. "You'll have to go to the works to have them fitted." While Gordon was being mended, Henry pulled the express. But one morning, just before Gordon was due back, Henry was ill too. "We've no spare engine except Thomas," the inspector told the Fat Controller, "but he can't pull the train on his own." "Could Percy help?" asked the Fat Controller. The inspector shook his head. "The two of them with Duck might manage," he suggested. "It's only as far as the works. They're sure to have a spare engine there." So the three tank engines were coupled together, Thomas nearest the train, Duck in the middle, and Percy at the front. Then, slowly, they started. Come on, fussed Percy importantly. We're doing it, puffed Duck. Pull harder, rumbled Thomas to the others. The heavy train drew out of the platform. The engines couldn't go as fast as Gordon, but the passengers didn't mind. They knew that Percy, Thomas and Duck were doing their best. Expresses are not like branch line trains. They don't stop at all the stations, and the engines don't have a chance to get their breath back. Soon the three began to feel tired. They struggled valiantly up Gordon's hill, but the strain was beginning to tell. I'm glad we didn't stick there, thought Thomas. Gordon would never have let us hear the last of it. But the hill proved too much for Percy. His driver blew his whistle and stopped the train. We can't take you off, Percy, said Thomas's driver. Do the best you can to keep your brakes off. It's not far now. This made things harder for the other two, but they struggled gamely on, twin columns of steam shooting high into the air. We're nearly there, puffed Thomas and Duck together as they summoned a last brave effort. Poor Percy had no steam left to say anything. They were just passing the works when Duck found he could go no further. Thomas could not pull the heavy train on his own, and the cavalcade came to a standstill a few yards short of the station platform. And there, standing watching from the works siding, stood Gordon. The Fat Controller, who'd been on the train, told the three engines he was proud of them. You did very well to get so far, he said, and now you deserve a rest. Duck, Percy and Thomas were uncoupled, and a new engine took their place. As the tank engines moved wearily away, Gordon looked at Thomas and smiled. Then he took 3 deep breaths and winked. He didn't need to say anything. Thomas knew exactly what he meant. Toby was delighted to take Percy's stone trucks down to the harbour. He thought it a wonderful treat. Percy could not understand why. It's only a harbour, he said, nothing special. I like it, said Toby. It reminds me of the old days. I worked at a harbour on the other railway. I told you, remember? Because Toby had only a small water tank, he always had to refill it at the station by the river. What if we've run out of water halfway? Toby wondered anxiously. We shan't, said his driver confidently. But what if the water column breaks down? Asked Toby. Thomas warned me about the water from that river. His driver laughed. Don't worry, Toby, he said. We shan't take you fishing.
harbour was busy and Toby worked hard. Not only did the stone trucks have to be taken down, but when they had been unloaded, they had to be sent back, often full of things brought in by the ships. One day, the stone trucks from the quarry didn't come. Toby waited in the yard. "It's not like Mavis to be late," he said to himself. "I hope she hasn't had an accident and met another lorry that forgot to look where it was going." At last the station master came over. "Mavis wasn't well this morning," he said. "She's better now and she's on her way." And indeed, it was not long before, with a cheerful toot, Mavis rumbled into the yard. Toby wasted no time in setting off himself. At the harbour, Toby found so many trucks waiting to go back that there was hardly room for what he had brought. "Phew," whistled the driver. "Some Megatrain. 2 journeys really, but we haven't time today. We could leave some and make 2 trips tomorrow." "Can't we take them all now?" asked Toby. The guard scratched his head and Toby's crew looked doubtful. "We shall be all right," urged Toby. And so they agreed. But Toby had forgotten his small water tank. He had also forgotten that the journey was all uphill. He had to work hard and use so much steam that by the time they reached the station by the river, he had very little water left. His fireman put in the water pipe and turned the tap. Nothing happened. "Oh dear," groaned Toby. "Now what?" "You could make it on your own," said his driver, "but not pulling this load." Then he winked at the fireman. "Well," the driver went on, "I do know somewhere." "Is it far?" asked Toby. The driver laughed. "Not really," he said, and went to see the signalman, who told him where to leave the trucks. Toby pushed them carefully into a siding. Then he was uncoupled and they set off up the line. "Where are we going to get water?" he asked. "You'll see," smiled his driver, and stopped Toby right in the middle of the river bridge. "Now," said the driver, "where's my bucket?" "Ugh," protested Toby, "you promised." His driver and fireman laughed heartily. "We're only pulling your wheels, Toby," they said at last. "We'll go to the top station for water, then come back for the trucks." When Toby told Percy what had happened, Percy wanted to help, but his driver reminded him that he had a train of his own to run in a few minutes. "Don't worry," said Toby, "I'll follow you down and have those trucks back up here in a jiffy." And he did too.
Most of the Fat Controller's engines accepted diesels. James had never liked them. "They're all right," said Henry, "just mixed traffic engines like you and me." "Mixed up engines, you mean?" James grunted. "With windows at each end, how can they know if they're coming or going?" "Toby has 2 cabs," remarked Duck, "and he gets on all right." "Toby's just a little engine," scoffed James. "If an important engine like me didn't know which way to turn, what would the railway come to?" All the engines agreed that James was becoming much too puffed up in his smoke box. "Making out his royalty or something," grumbled Henry. "It's disgusting." "I knew an engine called King James," remarked Duck, "in the old days at Paddington. King James the First, he was, but he didn't swank about like that." "Och, dinna be telling James that," pleaded Donald. "It's even mair of a misery he'll be making our lives." "Exactly," agreed Henry, "but who's going to trim his wheels for him?" The engines tried all sorts of ideas, but nothing worked. James grew so conceited that the others were glad when he was away. Even the coaches twittered anxiously to each other if they thought he was to pull them. One day, James came to the shed, fuming with rage. "Shunting," he snorted. "Where are Donald and Douglas? They should be here for jobs like that." But the twins were helping on Edward's branch line, so James had to do the work himself. James's train had long trucks called well wagons. These have bogey wheels at each end, with a low section between them. They're used to carry cars, tractors, and other heavy machinery. The shunting should have been easy, but James was cross and bumped the trucks. "Oh, oh, 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 oh!" they cried. Some of them slipped their brakes on to spite James. The weather was damp and misty too, so the shunting took a long time. At last James had only 2 trucks to fetch before his train was ready. Because of the mist, the signalman sometimes found it hard to see what was happening. James's driver told him that James would whistle when they had collected all the trucks and were clear of the points. They had almost finished when suddenly James heard a sharp beep beep from another engine close by. The signalman heard it too and thought it was James saying he was ready. He pulled the lever, setting the points for the main line. But James wasn't ready. The points changed when one of the trucks was halfway over them. "Stop!" squealed the truck, but it was too late. The signal toppled to the ground with a crash, just missing James. "That's torn it," said James's driver. "The Fat Controller won't like that." He didn't. He spoke severely about it because the signal was important and its loss was inconvenient. James knew that the accident was not his fault, but he was unusually quiet in the shed that evening. The others were relieved. "I suppose it must be difficult to know which way to go when you've got 2 cabs," whispered a voice. "But to go 2 ways at once with only 1 cab, that really is something." James pretended he hadn't heard.
Winter was passing, but there was still 1 or 2 late frosts, which made everything sugar-coated and sparkling in the spring sunshine. Each morning, Donald and Douglas took it in turns to bring a Bladez train from the small railway, and James then pulled the trucks to a place where the line was being mended. One morning, Donald was uncoupled and ran ahead into a short siding to let James take his place at the front of the trucks. But a hard frost had made the rails icy. When Donald tried to stop, his wheels locked and they slid on the ice. Before he could say "Fat Controller," he hit the buffers at the end of the siding. The buffers stopped him. That was what they were there for. But they were badly damaged. Donald was lucky. He wasn't hurt at all, just embarrassed. The other engines teased him. "You should go in for the skating championships," they said. Even Donald laughed, though he was worried about what the Fat Controller might say. But the Fat Controller only warned him to be more careful. He knew it hadn't really been Donald's fault. The next day, men were sent to mend the buffers. At last, James's repair work on the line was ending. Tomorrow's train, Douglas would be at the last for the time being, the Fat Controller told him. The next day, as Douglas drew his loaded trucks to a halt in their siding, James was waiting. "Here you are, James," Douglas said cheerfully. What are you gonna do now this job's finishing? Pull some passenger trains, I hope, replied James. I'm getting tired of doing the same thing all the time. Oh, never mind, said Douglas. Today's the last one. His fireman uncoupled the trucks and climbed back into the cab. Then Douglas puffed slowly into the short siding. At the end of the siding, the men who had been mending the buffers were standing to one side. They had pots of paint beside them, and had just finished painting the buffer bar bright red. That looks very smart, thought Douglas. Much better than it did before. The Fat Controller's probably glad the Don smashed it up. His driver put on the brakes. Nothing happened. The driver tried again. Still nothing. "Horrors!" exclaimed Douglas. "I can't stop!" The workmen watched in dismay. Douglas rode steadily along the line and smashed to splinters the buffers they had just spent 3 days mending. "Ouch!" exclaimed Douglas, opening his eyes cautiously. "That hurt." The new buffers had stopped him, but unfortunately, Douglas had been moving faster than Donald. He was in a terrible mess. "You silly great engine!" scolded the foreman, waving his paintbrush angrily. It still had red paint in it, and some of the paint flew out and stuck on Douglas's nose. 3 days' work!" the foreman said crossly, "and in 3 seconds you come and smash it all to pieces!" Douglas's front wheels were off the rails, so James had to come and rescue him. Later, the Fat Controller spoke sternly to Douglas about engines not taking care in sidings, and the red paint was left on Douglas's nose as a reminder.